How scapegoat survivors mute themselves by getting confused, and how to stop. A parent who is pathologically narcissistic has an excessive need for admiration. This wouldn't be much of a problem if they acted admirably, but they often don't. A narcissistic parent feels worthless at their core, yet cannot bear this. Instead, they wholly deny these feelings and find them in someone else. And once they identify the worthless person who is not themselves, they feel protected from what they fear in themselves. Too often, though, this other person is their scapegoat child. The child who the narcissistic parent sees as worthless must be convinced to act the part. The parent will devalue, deprive, and domineer this child with the conviction that this is what the child deserves. For the child to stay in the parent's reality, they must become what the parent is accusing them of. All the while, the narcissistic parent insists that their scapegoat child admire them. The child is put in the position of having to look up to the person who is looking down on them. The child's natural reaction will be to fight or flee from such abuse, but since the child needs the parent's goodwill to survive, they must mute these reactions and find a way to admire their abuser. In today's video, I discuss how a scapegoat child mutes themselves to meet their narcissistic parents' demand that they admire them. The child does this by confusing themselves about their narcissistic parents' mistreatment. First, the child questions what they are seeing from the parent. Is their parent mistreating them, or are they just too sensitive? Second, they question what they think about what they are seeing. Are they upset by their parents' actions, or are they just resistant to necessary guidance? Confusing themselves in these two ways allows the child to remain admiring of the parent. Scapegoat survivors can regain clarity about what they really think and feel about the people around them, though. I'll show you how to connect with people who value your true feelings over your admiration. Well, my name is Jay Reed, and I'm a practicing licensed psychotherapist in California and scapegoat survivor myself. I've worked to understand what helps scapegoat survivors know that they are now safe to unmute themselves in their lives. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. The first pillar is making sense of what happened so that you know it was not your fault. The second pillar is gaining distance today from narcissistic abusers and closeness to safe people. And the third pillar is living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And if you'd like a low-cost option to understand and apply the 3 pillars of recovery in your own life, then I suggest checking out my Rise and Reclaim Healing Toolkit for Scapegoat Survivors. In it, you'll receive my book called Growing Up as a Scapegoat Child to Narcissistic Parents, A Guide to Healing. And this book is a comprehensive but in-depth guide to these 3 pillars of recovery. If you're a scapegoat survivor, you will likely find a lot of your own experience in these pages. Most importantly, you'll see how to apply the 3 pillars so that you can reclaim the quality of life that you deserve. In the toolkit, you'll also receive a worksheet that asks you to brainstorm ways to apply these pillars on a monthly basis. And you can find the link to the toolkit in the description box below. Why confusion beats clarity for the scapegoat child? Well, narcissistic parents expect admiration from everyone, even those whom they treat the worst. This includes the scapegoat child, who receives a steady diet of devaluation, deprivation, and domineering, otherwise known as what I call the 3 Ds. The scapegoat child faces a soul-wrenching dilemma. They can know how cruelly the person they need to survive is treating them, but this knowledge could render hopelessness that they will never get the love they need from this person. And that's not a survivable proposition. Or the child can deny to themselves that their parent is treating them poorly. This option lets the child maintain hope that their parent can and will love them. The child just needs to fix themselves so that they are acceptable to the parent. The scapegoat child has to take this second option. Hope in their parent is more important than hope in themselves at this stage of life. But the child must fuzzy what they know about their parents' cruelty towards them. This is made more urgent by the demand to admire the parent. So the child confuses themselves. This helps them not see what could stop them from admiring their parent. Well, let's look at an anonymized fictional client to illustrate. In high school, Terrence found himself on the receiving end of his father's constant criticism. Whatever Terrence did, his father would find fault with. When Terrence came home from school, he was greeted with some complaint about what he did or didn't do. His father might say, "I told you to clean out the garage this week, and you still haven't done it, young man. How many times do I have to tell you? You're going to do it now." It didn't matter if Terrence had an important test to study for or important plans with a friend. He had to obey his father or face even harsher punishment. And no one else in his family acknowledged how poorly Terrence was being treated. His mother would busy herself when her husband went in on her son. She kept enough emotional distance from Terrence so that he would not seek her help. His siblings feared their father too much to show compassion towards Terrence. All they knew was he seemed to make their father mad, and that spelled trouble for everyone. There were times when his father, though, was not yelling at him. He might be ignoring Terrence or bragging about the latest deal he closed at work. In these moments, Terrence felt compelled to show how impressed he was with his father. "Wow, Dad, that's awesome. How did you figure out how to do stuff like that at work?" These words came easily to Terrence. He felt hijacked by the demand that he show nothing but admiration towards his father. His unconscious hope was that if he could show just how much he was on his father's side, that the man would stop criticizing him and maybe finally love Terrence as much as his father seemed to love himself. How the scapegoat child confuses themselves. I know not what I see. The scapegoat child may confuse themselves by fuzzying what they see from the narcissistic parent. Via the psychological process of denial, a scapegoat child may forget how their parent hurts them. Experiences may only feel real when they are happening. Afterwards, they may be hard to grasp. The scapegoat child might do well in school or other areas. However, they may struggle to feel a sense of continuity in life. The mandate to deny what they are seeing to themselves is disruptive to consciousness. They must be in the practice of continually forgetting what they just saw from the parent. This practice makes it hard to feel like you're the same person over time. I know not what I think about what I see. The scapegoat child may also confuse themselves by fuzzying what they think about what they see. This may be a more damaging way of confusing yourself. It requires you to distort psychological vision. Distortion at this level can also break our sense of connection to reality. As a scapegoat child grows older, they may have a harder time denying what they see from their parent. Now they may have to attack their own critical thoughts about what they are seeing. They don't think that mom is cruel when she devalues them by saying that she didn't think they had the talent to succeed at school. Instead, no, mom is just being helpful in telling her child the truth about who they really are. Or father still has the child's well-being in mind when he hits that child. The child sees he is being hit, but knows he needs the correction his father is supposedly giving him. Now it's extremely hard for the child to know when they see bad behavior from others. They are too practiced in not seeing such behavior and or not thinking critically about it. Well, let's go back to Terrence. He never said a word to anyone about how his father treated him. As far as he consciously knew, he had a great father. When he thought back on the day before, he could not remember his father's bouts of criticism at him. He'd remember some activities that he did and maybe a pleasant memory of what had happened at school, and that was about it. Sometimes his father's attacks were so cruel and intense that he could not help but remember them. But Terrence did not remember them the way they happened. He didn't recall being an undeserving victim to a grown man's emotional abuse. He saw something else. Terrence started with seeing and feeling his own badness. Then his father's screams at him were just in response to what was supposedly so bad in Terrence. These memories didn't interfere with Terrence's ability to see his father as superior. They just showed how inferior Terrence was. How confusion leads to muting. If you don't know what you are seeing, then there is nothing to speak up about. Similarly, if you don't know what you think about what you are seeing, then there's also nothing to speak up about. Once this is the case, the world around them and the world inside them seems to run in a way that's impossible to understand for the scapegoat child. They find the narcissistic parent's commands then helpful in steering them through this very confusing life. The child grows convinced that they can't make it on their own because they're just too confused. And this also fits in with the parent's need to domineer them. So the confused scapegoat child can now readily admire their parent, no matter how poorly their parent treats them. After all, this parent is providing them with needed direction so often. If we've lost faith in our judgment, then it becomes easy to admire the person who, again, supposedly offers the better judgment we need. Well, when Terrence got to college, he didn't know what to do with all the free time he suddenly had. He forced himself to study much of the day. He'd make schedules for himself where he would study for 8 hours on top of his classes. Then on Friday and Saturday nights, he'd go out and drink at campus parties with his friends. His weekend days then were spent studying all day, usually hungover. And then the cycle would repeat each week. He'd have to call home every Sunday night so that his father could grill him about his performance in his classes. These conversations always included a threat that his father would stop paying for college if Terrence got anything less than a 3.8 GPA. Terrence assumed his father's threats were for his own good. He'd tell his father how much he appreciated him for keeping after him about school. Terrence had too much practice at this point with muting himself to know what he wanted. He could take direction, but he couldn't provide direction for himself. He had to keep reporting to his father to get his marching orders. It was really the only way he had to safely exist at the time. The consequences of muting out of confusion. Well, an adult who has had to confuse themselves to stay admiring of a narcissistic parent faces several challenges. First, difficulty knowing your own opinion. We are routinely asked for our opinion in life. If you've had to confuse yourself in the way I'm describing today, then it may be hard to know what you really think. Or you may entertain a point of view, but immediately discard it as defective for one reason or another. A fictitious anonymized client named Gerald could easily carry out tasks at his job as a software developer when he was told what to do. He was a brilliant guy and he could figure out the answers to problems that many of his colleagues had difficult with. He was quickly promoted and asked to figure out the strategy for the company. But Gerald was suddenly dumbstruck. He found it impossible to consider strategic options and choose the one he thought would work best. He'd immediately tell himself reasons why whatever he thought would work would not work. He grew paralyzed and then anxious about not being able to get his work done in a timely fashion, not knowing when to take offense. If you've had to mute yourself via confusion to admire your narcissistic parent, then it may be unfamiliar to take offense at someone else's behavior. You've had to deny your anger at the offensive actions of your narcissistic parent for so long. Without gaining insight into how this operated in your childhood, it can be difficult to know that you no longer have to stay admiring of everyone else. Adults with this history may be undisturbed by overt shows of disrespect from people close to them. They may then be overcome with rage when a stranger acts rudely. They are left feeling skeptical of their own judgment of potentially offensive behaviors. Another anonymized fictitious client named Julio had a friend named Carl who would routinely put Julio down. He would always do it in a joking way, though. He especially liked to pounce on Julio's honest mistakes. If Julio forgot his laptop at work, for example, Carl would say, "Dude, what's your problem? Can't you keep anything straight in that head of yours?" Julio would shrug off these comments by Carl. He assumed that Carl meant no harm and wouldn't be saying this if Julio wasn't so prone to making mistakes. In contrast to the permissiveness he showed Carl, Julio would grow irate if a stranger was rude to him. Driving left him tense and drained because he would always be on the lookout for people trying to cut him off or pass him. He couldn't help but take offense to the slightest infractions of others on the road. This never led to encounters with other drivers, but Julio would be fuming in his mind. A mind is a terrible thing to waste. Well, this slogan used to be on commercials for the UNCF when I was growing up. It has applicability to the scapegoat child and adult survivor too. Scapegoat children and survivors tend to be very perceptive people. This is often a core feature of who they are. And yet, to remain admiring of their narcissistically abusive parent, they have to desecrate this feature. Scapegoat survivors are often keenly aware that they are having to limit the possibilities of their own minds. They often don't know why, though. They can feel inhibited from being what they know at a deep level they can be. Worse, they may not know what holds them back as a result of having to confuse themselves in these ways. So another anonymized fictitious client named Julia lived with a deeply felt sense that she could not be all of herself. She devoted herself to caring for the people around her, and she found it impossible to consider her own needs in the process. Her mother felt especially entitled to Julia's care. She'd make it outlandish demands, but Julia thought she had no choice but to meet them. Julia was very intelligent, yet felt like there was something in her life she could not let herself see. This pained her because she couldn't make full use of her own mind. She yearned to be able to know and speak what she really thought and felt about having to meet these demands, but didn't know how. So in summary, the adult scapegoat survivor can find it very difficult to think critically. Such thought requires the freedom to come to whatever conclusion your mind arrives at. Survivors have grown accustomed to only being able to think thoughts that led to the conclusion that their narcissistic parent is admirable. It's a form of muting that compromises their right to see and know the truth about their lives. But it's absolutely necessary because if they conclude something that leads them not to admire their parent, then the relationship falls apart. And it's the top priority that that relationship to the parent stay intact. How to dispel the confusion and unmute yourself? Well, in order to unmute yourself and live without confusion, you must establish different conditions than the ones that made muting necessary in the first place. There are 3 steps to doing this that correspond to those 3 pillars of recovery that I talked about earlier. Make sense of what happened that led to you muting via confusion. And of course, that corresponds to pillar number 1. If you're watching this video, then you've likely determined there was something off in your upbringing. The mandate to remain confused instead of aware of what's wrong may have gnawed at you. This step encourages you to keep pondering these questions, to keep paying attention to the feelings that chafe at having to abdicate your judgment to those that supposedly know better. As you learn about what narcissistic parents put their scapegoat child through, you can create a new way to see things. In this frame, you can see the pressure to confuse yourself rather than having to act from it. Although it may still be hard for life to feel differently, this is an essential first step. Pillar number 2, moving away from those that require your confusion. This is one of the most critical ways you can establish new conditions for yourself in order to unmute. The reason you learned to mute yourself via confusion in the first place was because an important relationship depended upon you doing so. To know it's now safe to unmute, you need experience in new relationships that do not depend on you staying muted. This first means moving away from current relationships that insist on you remaining muted. Next, you need to find new relationships where it's safe to know and speak freely. And here's some tips for finding such individuals. First, they have a relatively stable sense of their own worth. They're not disproportionately wounded by small slights. They don't expect themselves to be perfect and therefore don't expect that others find them to be. 2, they're genuinely curious about what you think and feel. They make room in the friendship or relationship to hear what you have to say. And 3, they remain supportive and caring towards you even when you share what you don't like about their behavior. They don't require constant admiration, so your honest statements about what doesn't work for you don't threaten them. And the 3rd pillar, live in defiance of the narcissistic rule that you be confused. This step requires conscious effort to pay attention to what you honestly think and feel, especially when those thoughts and feelings don't produce admiration towards someone important to you. As you do this, you can further your defiance by sharing your true thoughts and feelings with someone you hope is safe to do so with. The other person's response can let you know if they are, in fact, the safe person that you hope they would be. If they're not overly wounded and remain curious about what you're telling them and also maintain their goodwill towards you, then they're likely safe. Well, let's look at how Terrence employed these steps to regain clarity. After college, Terrence took an accounting job about 45 minutes from his hometown. He met a woman named Michelle and they got married. A year later, Michelle gave birth to their first son. Terrence was filled with love at the sight of his child. As he parented the boy with Michelle, he found himself instinctually acting much different than how his father reacted to him. When his son turned 3 years old, he realized he could speak the word no for things that he didn't want to do. If his son was playing with blocks and Terrence told him it was time to put them away, then he might say at a loud volume, no. In such moments, Terrence appreciated his son's independence and strength of character to be able to speak up for himself. Terrence felt no desire to squash his son's protest. He wanted to get his message across while preserving his son's dignity, and he was usually successful at this. As Terrence and his wife were going to bed one night, he told her how different he reacted to their son than how his father had reacted to him. He said, I always thought that I was just a bad kid, and that's why my dad would always yell at me. But I never feel like putting our son down if he makes a mistake. I think that I gave my father too much credit and overlooked the way he mistreated me. Tears welled up in Michelle's eyes as she thought about the pain Terrence had endured in his upbringing. She was a therapist herself and knew that his father sounded like someone who was pathologically self-absorbed with little to no empathy for the feelings of others. She told Terrence that it sounded like he was the family scapegoat, and she said that she could offer him a referral for a therapist to work through some of how this had impacted him. Terrence said he'd think about it. In the next few weeks, Terrence looked up as much as he could about family scapegoats. He learned that this role can emerge when a narcissistic parent is involved. The more he read about pathological narcissism, the more he found it to describe his father. Terrence decided to take his wife up on her offer to help him find a therapist so he could talk about all of this. So he had his first appointment the next week and began what was to be a 5-year-long therapy. And over the course of these years, Terrence would bring up memories of his father routinely berating him throughout his childhood. His therapist responded with curiosity about how Terrence felt in such moments. They developed a trusting relationship where they focused much less on his father's actions and much more on Terrence's experience. Instead of being all alone in this abuse like he was growing up, he gradually got to feel accompanied in what he went through and know that his feelings are important. As this new understanding developed in him, he began to take more offense at people in his life who treated him like his father did. He had a longtime friend named Drew who never passed up an opportunity to make fun of Terrence. He'd not known there was anything wrong with how Drew was treating him, though. As Terrence learned it was now safer to be less confused about his father's treatment of him, he also became less confused about how Drew had a negative impact on his life. He talked about his desire to protect himself from people like Drew. We worked through Terrence's guilt at putting his emotional well-being ahead of Drew's. After all, that was the basis for his entire relationship with his father. Despite the man's abuse, Terrence felt intensely disloyal for defying his father's rule that he didn't deserve protection. But with the support of therapy and his wife, Terrence freed himself of this rule and eventually set limits with his father. He told the man that he was not going to continue conversations where he experienced his father to berate him. After doing this a couple of times during year 4 of his therapy, his father adjusted. They grew to have a cordial yet emotionally distant relationship going forward, and that was just fine with Terrence. Well, if you're a scapegoat survivor and you find yourself sometimes getting muddled in what you think and feel, particularly when it's of a critical nature of someone who's been important to you, then I hope today's video has been helpful. And with that, I want to thank you for tuning in and for your support of this channel and the resources around it. And I really appreciate knowing at times that folks have found those to be helpful. And with that, I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.